Marcus Ellington stood quietly beside his sedan while the flashing patrol lights painted streaks of blue and red across the damp pavement. The evening air carried the smell of fresh rain rising from the asphalt, and traffic rolled steadily through the busy intersection without paying much attention to the scene unfolding on the shoulder. His charcoal gray suit fit neatly, although the long day had left faint creases along the sleeves. A weathered leather briefcase rested against the front tire, and inside it sat folders filled with legal notes that he still intended to review before sunrise. None of that mattered now. What mattered was remaining calm. Marcus had learned years ago that calm was often the only shield people expected him to abandon. He slowly reached for his wallet only after receiving permission, keeping every movement deliberate enough that there could be no misunderstanding. His law license rested behind several ordinary business cards, slightly worn from years of courtroom appearances, committee meetings, and community legal clinics that rarely appeared in newspaper headlines. He handed it over without a word, his expression composed, his breathing even. The officer barely glanced at it before letting out a quiet laugh that sounded more dismissive than curious. Marcus had heard that laugh before. It had followed him through college interviews, scholarship receptions, courthouse elevators, and expensive law conferences where strangers assumed he had wandered into the wrong room. None of those moments had defined him, and neither would this one. Long before anyone knew his name beyond the legal community, Marcus had been the son of a middle school history teacher and a postal worker in Durham, North Carolina. His parents believed that dignity was something nobody could hand you and nobody could take away unless you surrendered it yourself. His father often reminded him that every difficult conversation revealed more about the other person than about the one being judged. Those words stayed with Marcus each time he faced unnecessary suspicion. They had shaped the steady rhythm of his voice and the patience that many people confused with weakness. During law school, he worked late evenings in the university library after spending afternoons helping low-income families complete housing paperwork. While classmates competed for prestigious internships, Marcus volunteered at neighborhood legal aid offices where frightened parents arrived carrying eviction notices instead of hope. He remembered the gratitude in their eyes when someone finally explained complicated legal language in plain English. Those moments mattered more than awards hanging on polished office walls. They reminded him why he had chosen the law in the first place. It had never been about prestige. It had always been about fairness. That same belief followed him into every courtroom, every mediation session, and every community meeting where ordinary people simply wanted someone to listen. As the officer continued examining the documents with visible skepticism, Marcus quietly looked beyond the patrol car toward a small diner glowing across the street. Families laughed through the front windows. A little girl pressed her hands against the glass while waiting for pancakes, completely unaware that a few yards away another lesson about assumptions was quietly unfolding. Marcus allowed himself the smallest smile. He hoped she would grow up in a country where respect arrived before judgment. Until then, he would continue meeting moments like this with the same quiet strength that had carried him through every closed door that eventually opened. Officer Daniel Mercer shifted his weight beside the patrol car, the polished badge on his uniform catching the glow of passing headlights. He had worn that badge for nearly 12 years, and somewhere along the way confidence had quietly hardened into certainty. Every shift reinforced the belief that his instincts were almost never wrong. Tonight felt no different. He glanced once more at the law license before handing it back with an expression that suggested he had already reached his own conclusion. In his mind, expensive legal credentials did not belong in the hands of someone who looked as ordinary as the man standing before him. Mercer folded his arms and let his eyes wander over the modest sedan, the slightly worn briefcase, and the simple wristwatch Marcus wore instead of the luxury brands he associated with successful attorneys. To him, the picture did not fit the title. That assumption settled into his thoughts with quiet confidence rather than open hostility, making it even harder for him to recognize. Around them, the city continued its evening routine. Cars rolled past at 35 miles per hour. A city bus stopped across the intersection while passengers stepped onto the sidewalk beneath bright streetlights. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted from the diner across the road as another family walked inside laughing together. None of them noticed the conversation unfolding only a few yards away. Mercer finally spoke again, his tone calm, but edged with disbelief. He remarked that anyone could purchase a framed diploma online and that impressive titles were easy to claim. Marcus listened without interrupting. His face remained composed, revealing neither frustration nor embarrassment. Silence had become a discipline long before it became a habit. Mercer interpreted that silence as uncertainty instead of restraint. He requested another form of identification and carefully examined every card Marcus handed over. He compared photographs, checked expiration dates, and studied signatures as though expecting to uncover a contradiction hidden somewhere between the lines. Finding none only deepened his suspicion instead of easing it. Years earlier, Mercer had entered law enforcement with genuine ideals. His father had served as a deputy sheriff in a small county, teaching him that public service demanded fairness above all else. Those lessons had once guided every decision he made. Yet over time, difficult encounters, repeated stress, and unchallenged assumptions slowly reshaped his perspective. Without realizing it, he had begun trusting stereotypes more than individual facts. He rarely questioned that change because nobody around him ever challenged it. Several younger officers admired his confidence, often treating his opinions as experience rather than bias. That quiet approval reinforced habits that had formed almost unnoticed. Mercer reached for the shoulder microphone attached to his uniform and requested additional verification through dispatch. His voice remained steady, professional, and convinced that the computer would eventually confirm what he already believed. Marcus watched without protest, resting one hand lightly on the handle of his leather briefcase. The cool evening breeze stirred the leaves of a nearby oak tree, carrying with it the distant sound of a church bell marking the top of the hour. For a brief moment, everything seemed suspended between assumption and truth. Neither man spoke again. One waited for evidence to support a judgment already made. The other waited for facts to speak louder than appearances, knowing that patience often revealed character more clearly than any argument ever could. The soft burst of static from the dispatch radio broke the silence, but the answer Officer Daniel Mercer expected did not arrive immediately. The delay seemed to strengthen his confidence rather than weaken it. He glanced toward Marcus Ellington with the quiet certainty of someone convinced that patience would eventually confirm his first impression. Marcus noticed the expression but did not respond to it. Instead, he gently picked up his leather briefcase and rested it against his leg, careful not to make any sudden movement that could be misunderstood. The evening breeze had grown cooler after the rain, and tiny drops still clung to the branches overhead, reflecting the glow of the streetlights like scattered pieces of glass. A delivery truck rolled through the intersection, its tires humming against the wet pavement before disappearing into the distance. Marcus finally spoke, his voice measured and respectful. He explained that he had no objection to the verification process because accountability protected both citizens and officers alike. He added that every public servant carried a responsibility to respect procedure without allowing assumptions to replace evidence. His words were calm, almost conversational, yet they carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades studying the law instead of merely quoting it. Mercer folded his arms again. He replied that experience had taught him to trust his instincts. Marcus nodded politely before answering that instincts could begin an investigation, but only facts should finish one. The sentence lingered in the cool night air. It was not spoken as a challenge. It was offered as a principle. A young trainee officer who had arrived only minutes earlier stood several feet away beside the second patrol vehicle. His name tag read Ethan Brooks. Fresh from the police academy, he remained silent, watching the exchange with careful attention. He noticed that Marcus never raised his voice, never interrupted, and never attempted to embarrass anyone despite the uncomfortable situation. Something about that quiet composure contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding the traffic stop. Dispatch finally answered the request for verification, but the signal faded beneath interference before the information became clear. Mercer frowned and requested that the records be checked again using the identification number printed on the law license. He believed the second attempt would settle the matter once and for all. Marcus simply waited. His watch reflected a thin ribbon of silver light as he looked briefly toward the courthouse rising above the downtown skyline. Earlier that afternoon, he had spent 3 hours meeting with prosecutors, public defenders, and community advocates to improve legal access for military veterans returning home. None of those people knew he would end his evening standing beside a quiet road explaining his identity to strangers. Yet he refused to let irony become resentment. Every difficult encounter presented another opportunity to demonstrate the very principles he defended inside courtrooms. Officer Brooks slowly approached Marcus and spoke in a low voice that carried genuine respect. He thanked him for remaining patient because not everyone would have handled the situation with such composure. Marcus offered a warm smile and answered that respect was easiest to practice precisely when it felt most difficult. Brooks lowered his eyes thoughtfully. Mercer overheard the exchange, but remained focused on the radio clipped to his shoulder. Moments later, the speaker crackled once again. This time the dispatcher's tone sounded different. More careful, more deliberate. Mercer straightened instinctively as each word emerged through the static, and the certainty that had guided every decision since the traffic stop began quietly started to give way to something he had not expected. The dispatch radio hissed for a brief second before the operator spoke with unusual precision. The calm, professional voice carried across the quiet roadside. Unit 12, please confirm. Identification has been verified. Subject is Marcus Ellington, active member of the State Attorney General's office. Security clearance confirmed. Stand by for supervisory notification. The words seemed to settle over the intersection more heavily than the rain clouds hanging above it. Officer Daniel Mercer did not answer immediately. His hand remained frozen against the radio microphone, while his eyes slowly lifted toward the man who had never once raised his voice. The certainty that had guided every decision during the stop quietly dissolved into uncertainty. Beside the second patrol vehicle, Officer Ethan Brooks looked from Marcus to his training officer, trying to understand how the atmosphere had changed so completely in only a few seconds. Another transmission arrived before anyone spoke. Unit 12, the regional supervisor has been notified. Please remain on scene. Mercer swallowed quietly. His shoulders, once squared with complete confidence, now seemed noticeably heavier. Marcus simply nodded once, neither triumphant nor offended. He had heard confirmations like this many times throughout his career, but they had never become satisfying. Recognition earned only after doubt carried little joy. A cool breeze swept across the sidewalk, carrying the faint scent of wet oak leaves from the city park half a block away. Inside the diner across the street, the little girl Marcus had noticed earlier pressed another crayon across her coloring page while her parents smiled over cups of coffee. Ordinary life continued without realizing that another invisible lesson had just unfolded outside. Mercer finally cleared his throat. His voice no longer carried the certainty from moments before. Mr. Ellington, it appears there has been a misunderstanding. Marcus answered gently that facts often arrived after assumptions, which was exactly why procedure mattered. His words contained no sarcasm. They sounded more like something shared in a classroom than during a roadside stop. The simplicity of that response unsettled Mercer even more than anger would have. He realized that the man standing before him had been given every opportunity to respond with humiliation, yet had chosen dignity instead. A black sport utility vehicle quietly turned onto the shoulder behind the patrol cars. Its headlights dimmed before parking. A middle-aged woman wearing a Navy state jacket stepped out with calm purpose. Her identification badge reflected beneath the streetlights as she approached. Regional Supervisor Linda Carver greeted Marcus by name before extending her hand warmly. "Thank you for waiting, Mr. Ellington. I apologize for the delay. We received the verification request and came personally as soon as we understood the situation." Mercer felt the color drain from his face. The respectful greeting confirmed everything more clearly than the radio ever could. Brooks stood silently beside him, watching the exchange with widened eyes. Supervisor Carver turned toward Mercer with composed professionalism rather than anger. She asked only one question. "Officer, before dispatch confirmed his identity, what specific evidence caused you to doubt the validity of his credentials?" The question lingered in the cool night air. Mercer searched for an answer supported by facts, but every explanation he considered sounded weaker than the silence surrounding him. For the first time that evening, he recognized that the hardest investigation waiting to be completed was not the one recorded on the dispatch log. It was the one beginning inside his own conscience. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sounds came from raindrops slipping from the branches overhead, the distant hum of traffic, and the soft buzz of the patrol lights reflecting across the wet pavement. Officer Daniel Mercer lowered his eyes to the identification still resting in his hands. It looked exactly the same as it had a few minutes earlier. The document had not changed. Only his understanding had. Marcus Ellington quietly accepted the silence without trying to fill it. He had spent enough years inside courtrooms to know that truth often arrived more powerfully after people stopped talking. Regional Supervisor Linda Carver remained beside the patrol vehicle with the calm posture of someone who understood that the most important lessons could not be forced. She glanced briefly toward Officer Ethan Brooks, whose expression revealed both surprise and careful reflection. The younger officer seemed less interested in the unexpected title Marcus carried than in the remarkable patience he had shown throughout the encounter. Marcus looked across the street where the warm lights inside the neighborhood diner softened the darkness outside. Families continued eating dinner. Friends laughed over steaming cups of coffee. A waitress carried a fresh slice of apple pie to an elderly couple sitting near the front window. The ordinary beauty of the evening reminded him why public service mattered. Every decision made by people wearing a badge or carrying legal authority eventually reached ordinary families who simply wanted to live peacefully. That thought had guided nearly every case he had accepted during his career. He believed justice was never measured by how leaders treated powerful people. It was measured by how they treated complete strangers on ordinary evenings exactly like this one. Mercer finally handed back the law license with noticeably slower hands. His voice remained quiet. He admitted that he should have listened more carefully instead of allowing first impressions to guide the conversation. Marcus accepted the license with a small nod and placed it carefully inside his wallet before sliding it into his jacket pocket. He answered that every person, regardless of profession, had moments that revealed something worth learning. The important question was whether those moments ended with excuses or with growth. Brooks listened closely, committing every word to memory. He realized that the conversation unfolding beside the road resembled none of the training scenarios from the police academy. Those lessons had focused on policies and procedures. Tonight, he was witnessing something deeper. He was watching character being tested without raised voices or public humiliation. Supervisor Carver folded her hands and looked toward the city skyline, where courthouse lights glowed against the clouds. She quietly remarked that authority carried its greatest weight when paired with humility. Marcus agreed with a gentle smile. He explained that laws could regulate behavior, but only personal integrity could transform a heart. The breeze grew softer as the clouds slowly drifted east, allowing a faint ribbon of moonlight to appear between them. The silver light settled across the wet pavement, washing away the harsh reflections of the emergency lights until the entire roadside seemed calmer than before. Mercer stood silently beside his patrol car, watching that quiet change unfold. For the first time in many years, he understood that respect could never be demanded by a uniform alone. It had to be earned through every choice, every conversation, and every assumption that a person was willing to question before speaking. Regional Supervisor Linda Carver took one slow step toward Marcus Ellington, her polished shoes leaving faint reflections on the rain-soaked pavement. The flashing patrol lights had finally been switched off, allowing the quiet glow of the street lamps to replace the harsh blue and red that had dominated the roadside only minutes before. The atmosphere felt different now. Less defensive, more honest. Carver looked at Marcus with unmistakable professional respect before turning toward Officer Daniel Mercer. Her voice remained calm, carrying neither anger nor accusation. She explained that Mr. Ellington had spent years leading statewide initiatives on ethics training, community trust, and equal access to justice. Several police departments across the state had voluntarily adopted legal education programs developed under his office. Mercer listened without moving. Each sentence seemed to reveal another layer of the man he had judged within moments of meeting him. The irony settled heavily on his conscience. The person he had doubted had dedicated much of his career to strengthening the very institutions Mercer had sworn to serve. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly, almost uncomfortable hearing his accomplishments listed aloud. Recognition had never been the purpose of his work. He quietly remarked that hundreds of public servants deserved equal credit because lasting change was always built by teams rather than individuals. Carver smiled gently, unsurprised by the response. She had worked beside Marcus for nearly 8 years and had rarely heard him speak about his own achievements. That humility, more than any title, had earned the respect of judges, prosecutors, public defenders, and community leaders throughout the state. Officer Ethan Brooks watched the exchange with growing admiration. Until that evening, he had assumed leadership looked loud, commanding, and impossible to ignore. Standing only a few feet away from Marcus, he realized genuine authority often sounded quiet enough that people needed to choose to listen. Mercer finally found the courage to raise his eyes. He admitted that he had formed conclusions long before collecting facts. The confession came slowly, each word measured with visible sincerity. Marcus met his gaze without resentment. He answered that every professional carried invisible blind spots. The danger was never making a mistake. The danger was refusing to recognize one after truth appeared. Those words settled into the evening with remarkable gentleness. No lecture, no humiliation, only an invitation to grow. A courthouse clock echoed faintly across downtown as the hour changed. Somewhere nearby, church bells answered with a softer rhythm. The sounds blended together beneath the cool night sky, reminding Marcus why symbols of justice and faith often stood at the center of old American towns. Both represented ideals people continually struggled to live up to. Carver reached into her vehicle and removed a slim leather portfolio. Inside rested invitations for the upcoming State Justice Partnership Conference scheduled only 2 weeks away. She turned toward Mercer and Brooks before explaining that departments from across the state would attend workshops focused on constitutional policing, public trust, and unbiased decision-making. Then she looked directly at Mercer. Mr. Ellington will deliver the opening address. I believe tonight has already introduced the first lesson. Mercer remained silent, but this time his silence carried understanding instead of certainty. He slowly extended his hand toward Marcus. Not because of the office he held, not because supervisors were watching, but because, for the first time that evening, he truly recognized the character of the man standing before him. Officer Daniel Mercer looked at his outstretched hand for a brief moment before Marcus Ellington accepted it with a steady grip. There was nothing dramatic about the gesture. No applause rose from the quiet street. No crowd gathered around them. It was simply two men standing beneath the fading glow of streetlights while the last traces of rain disappeared into the pavement. Yet for Mercer, the handshake carried more weight than any award he had received during his years in uniform. He released a slow breath and admitted that he had allowed appearances to speak louder than evidence. His voice was quiet enough that only Marcus, Supervisor Linda Carver, and Officer Ethan Brooks could hear every word. Marcus answered with the same calm sincerity that had guided the entire evening. He explained that apologies became meaningful only when they inspired different choices tomorrow. Everyone carried the ability to change, but only those willing to confront uncomfortable truths ever truly did. Mercer lowered his eyes for a moment before nodding. He understood that forgiveness did not erase mistakes. It created an opportunity to become someone who would not repeat them. Supervisor Carver watched the exchange with quiet approval. She had attended countless disciplinary meetings throughout her career, but very few had ended with genuine reflection instead of defensiveness. She believed lasting reform began with conversations exactly like this one, where accountability and dignity existed together rather than competing against each other. Ethan Brooks quietly stepped closer to Marcus and thanked him for remaining patient throughout the encounter. He admitted that the evening had taught him more about public service than several weeks inside a classroom. Marcus smiled warmly. He told the young officer that every badge represented a promise rather than a privilege. Citizens remembered how they were treated long after they forgot the details of any specific encounter. Respect could calm situations before authority ever needed to. Brooks nodded thoughtfully, committing every sentence to memory. Across the street, the diner owner switched the sign on the front window from open to closing soon. The warm yellow light spilling onto the sidewalk softened the darkness surrounding the intersection. A waitress waved goodbye to the last family leaving the restaurant while a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh coffee into the night air. Marcus glanced toward the quiet building and remembered evenings from his childhood when his parents had ended long workdays sharing simple meals at neighborhood diners just like that one. They had taught him that success meant very little if it failed to make someone else's burden lighter. Those lessons had shaped every professional decision he made. Mercer reached into his patrol car, and removed the small notebook he carried during every shift. He turned to a blank page and carefully wrote one sentence across the top in neat block letters. Facts before assumptions. He closed the notebook without another word and slipped it back into his pocket. Marcus noticed the gesture but chose not to comment. Some promises were strongest when spoken only to oneself. Supervisor Carver finally checked the time and reminded Marcus that the conference planning committee would be waiting for him early the next morning. Marcus laughed softly and admitted that he still needed to finish reviewing several pages of legal briefs before sunrise. Mercer looked surprised. After everything that had happened, Marcus still intended to continue his work without complaint. Marcus simply answered that justice never paused because one evening became difficult. It continued with every new day, every ordinary conversation, and every person willing to choose fairness over fear. As he reached for his leather briefcase once more, the cool night no longer felt heavy. It felt hopeful, as though something far more important than a misunderstanding had quietly been set back on the right path. The following morning, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the stone steps of the State Justice Partnership Conference Center, turning the polished entrance into a sheet of warm gold. Officers, judges, attorneys, and community leaders arrived from every corner of the state, greeting one another with quiet conversations and the familiar sound of leather briefcases closing and opening as another day of public service began. Marcus Ellington stood near the entrance for a moment before walking inside, carrying the same weathered briefcase he had held the night before. Nothing about his appearance suggested that the previous evening had become an unforgettable lesson for everyone involved. He greeted the reception staff by name, thanked a volunteer for arranging the registration tables, and paused to help an elderly visitor locate the correct meeting room before continuing toward the main auditorium. A few minutes later, Officer Ethan Brooks entered with several members of his department. His eyes immediately found Marcus across the lobby, and he smiled with genuine respect. Close behind him walked Officer Daniel Mercer. His uniform looked as neat as ever, but something about his posture had changed. The confidence remained, yet it was now accompanied by a quieter sense of reflection. As he approached Marcus, he stopped without hesitation and thanked him once again, not only for his patience, but for refusing to answer judgment with bitterness. Marcus replied with the same calm warmth that had defined every conversation between them. He explained that every community became stronger when people chose understanding before pride. Supervisor Linda Carver watched from across the lobby with quiet satisfaction before signaling that the opening session was ready to begin. The auditorium gradually filled with hundreds of attendees. Conversations faded as Marcus stepped to the podium beneath the soft stage lights. He looked across the audience, recognizing uniforms, judicial robes, business suits, and community volunteers seated side by side. Instead of beginning with legal statistics or policy reforms, he shared a simple thought. He said that every badge, every courtroom, and every public office existed for one purpose alone: to serve people whose names might never appear in headlines. He reminded everyone that fairness was not measured during easy moments. It revealed itself when assumptions tempted people to forget the humanity standing directly in front of them. The room remained completely still. Mercer listened from the third row, understanding that the words were not directed at him alone. They belonged to everyone willing to examine the hidden assumptions they carried through daily life. When the presentation concluded, the audience rose together in quiet applause that lasted longer than anyone expected. Marcus acknowledged the gesture with a humble smile before stepping away from the podium. As the conference continued, sunlight poured through the tall windows overlooking the city. Outside, people hurried along sidewalks, children waited for school buses, and ordinary life unfolded exactly as it always had. Yet somewhere inside that ordinary day, a few hearts carried a different understanding than they had the evening before. Marcus walked slowly down the courthouse plaza after the conference ended, his footsteps steady against the stone walkway as a gentle breeze stirred the American flag above the building. He never looked back to measure whether anyone was watching. He simply continued forward, carrying nothing heavier than his briefcase and nothing stronger than the quiet conviction that dignity offered freely could change lives more deeply than power ever could.